In the last section, we took a look at video games and started out by talking about how video games were work, right? But how they were a kind of work that because it had multiple fairly immediate rewards in place, it was the kind of work we like to do. Then we went from there to talking about ethics in the video game realm and how we do things, we use words in the video game realm like killing, but we don't confuse those. We don't confuse the acts that we're doing when we're playing video games with the acts that we're doing in reality, right? There's a pretty clean delineation between the two. But then I ended up by talking about Baudrillard and gave you just a hint of Baudrillard's theory that maybe we weren't as cleanly delineating between simulation and reality as we think we are. So let's talk a little bit about postmodernists. And we're going to back up to this guy. We talked about him a little bit the week we talked about women in technology. Now, this guy was Martin Heidegger. Heidegger, as you may recall, was a 20th century existentialist and phenomenologist. But late in his life, he took this interesting turn, sort of like an anti technology turn. And here's essentially what he was concerned with. He said, we have stopped viewing nature the way we used to. We used to look at the natural world with awe and wonder. Uh, as a more primitive people, when a thunderstorm rolled in or a blizzard, these struck terror in our being, right? Because they were forces that threatened our lives. They put us to the test, whether our preparation had been successful, whether our annual farming had been successful, whether our livestock was good, right? The world was a scary place, and thus we viewed it with awe and wonder. But somewhere along our scientization of everything, our view of the world started to shift, says Heidegger. We stopped looking at the forest as, the magnificent place where, so many kinds of wildlife live, where you don't want to be caught after dark, but which was, the way that you could find things to gather in the forest to bring home, like mushrooms or berries or things like that. We stopped viewing the world that way, and we started viewing the forest as a large stockpile of potential lumber, right? Mountains were quarries. Water was drinkable water or potable water or non-potable water. And how can we make the non-potable water potable and things like that? We started to view nature as a thing to be harvested and stockpiled, says Heidegger. So we look at nature as a pile of resources. And because of that, we've sort of lost touch in a way with what the natural world actually means to us. Okay, so that's Heidegger. We talked about that a little bit. But Heidegger was incredibly influential, and he, though he didn't intend to, really laid the foundation for a group of philosophers, about a generation later, who called themselves the postmodernists. So the postmodernists had roots in people like Heidegger, but also in Nietzsche. They were interested in kind of trying to so just as Heidegger had kind of turned backward and re-aimed his guns at science and technology, the postmodernists were interested in basically doing this systematically, right? Aiming their guns back at other institutions and firing away. They wanted to challenge traditional goals and methods and assumptions in philosophy, in ethics, in science, in literature, in literary theory, right? Derrida was uh, spent his entire career engaging with literary criticism, right? And oftentimes postmodernists veered off into the extremely relativistic parts, into the self-defeating relativistic parts, right? And this is a reason why many contemporary philosophers don't take postmodernism terribly seriously, because in many cases, many famous postmodernists basically undermine themselves with their arguments. And consequently, one looks at the argument and says, well, there's not really much you can recover out of that. I mean, it's shocking, yes, but valid no, right? Um, but the philosopher who sort of coined the term postmodernism was Jean-Jacques Lyotard. And he kind of kicked off this movement that a number of others engaged in. One of them was Jean Baudrillard, who we're going to talk about a little. Marshall McLuhan, who we talked about a little while back, who is a communications theorist. I don't know if he would have considered himself a postmodernist, but a lot of philosophers kind of pull him in because they want him to be a postmodern philosopher because he was so destructive of media and communications and things like that. Deleuze and Guattari, Gilles Deleuze wrote dozens and dozens of books, all of which were fascinating and interesting reads, where he, tried to systematically disassemble just kind of simultaneously all epistemology and all psychology while using the two tools against each other. It's very, very interesting reading. A lot of fun. And then, of course, we already mentioned Derrida, who came up with deconstructionism, which was a new form of literary critique, one that very much challenged previous conceptions of how you're supposed to read something and how you're supposed to respond to something. While everybody else is looking there to see what the author really meant, Derrida is going, no, what we want to find out is what the author's hiding from you, right? What can we learn about the author that the author himself either didn't know or didn't want you to know? And so it's a very different turn on the way literary criticism was done. So that's kind of the family of postmodernists. Postmodernism is, I would argue, kind of in its decline at this point. But there, and again, I said a lot of philosophers don't take it terribly seriously, but actually there are there are portions here and there in it that where there's some tremendously good criticism of things that we've taken for granted. And in many ways, a postmodernist can say, look, uh, Descartes was doing this, right? Descartes came up with the whole evil deceiver thing. We're just doing the same thing. The difference is Descartes really wanted to dig himself out of the pit. We don't, right? I think that's one fair way of describing postmodernism. So Jean Baudrillard, two of the big terms that he coined were simulation and hyperreality. These became, I mean, obviously these words have been around for a long time, but he attached very specific philosophical meaning to these words. So in the 70s, he's observing TV. He watched this early French reality show called the Panopticon. Remember we talked about panopticons, that kind of prison where there was a tower in the middle and the guards stood in the tower and the people outside couldn't tell whether the people in the cells couldn't tell whether the guard was looking at them. Well, basically a French TV show following a similar theory where people are in I think it's a house. I think it's sort of like the real world on MTV back in the 90s or whatever. This idea that the camera is kind of always following people around, but they don't know when they're on camera and when they're not. Um, so he saw this TV show and he found it kind of chilling. The idea of being observed and being blind to the fact that you're being observed, but also that the observation is coming with modifications, right? You're not just being observed, but they're watching you and then they're injecting things in your way to give more drama to your life in this case, right? And then he saw nuclear power rising in the 80s, and he saw the birth of the modern computer in the workspace and then in the home, and all of this stuff kind of glommed together in his mind and bothered him. He was going, it seems like we're layering and layering and layering stuff on top of nature. Remember Heidegger? Right? Heidegger says, we stopped treating nature as something to live in awe of. Baudrillard's going, stop treating nature. We stopped thinking about nature. There is no way for us to really be in touch with nature again. The world we live in, says Baudrillard, is fake. Go out in your yard and look around. Right? The sidewalk isn't natural. The lawn isn't natural. The flower garden isn't natural. They might have a couple of natural elements, but these are elements that were carefully selected and groomed and in many cases genetically engineered and then planted very specifically. And then we take out the plants we don't like, we call them weeds, and we keep the plants we do like, we call them flowers and bushes and trees. He says we live in a manicured world that bears no resemblance to the natural world. It's a simulation. We took the parts that we liked and we uh, you know made them bigger, brighter, more productive, blah blah blah, and we tried to hide the parts that we don't like. So Baudrillard, and probably the easiest way to get this whole Baudrillard in a nutshell, there's a very small, like 60-page book called Simulations and Simulacrum, I think it was, published in the early 80s. It was kind of like little slice of Baudrillard, just two essays that he wrote explaining his theory of hyperreality. And in these essays, he talks about different phases of extracting ourselves from nature and building a new reality, right? So he says, all right, well, it starts out pretty innocuous, right? We're trying to reflect reality. So we come up with forms of art that imitate. Uh, we try and cultivate a field and grow stuff, right? But as we go, we find elements of nature that we don't like and we want to get rid of. So we might mask them or we might change them. He calls perverting them, right? We might do what we can to alter the natural so that it looks more appealing to us. But we keep doing that and we keep doing that and we keep doing that. And eventually we're removing ourselves from reality altogether. But we don't want to be removed from the world. We want a nicer version of the world. So we end up masking the absence of reality by building other stuff on top of it that makes us feel like we're in touch with reality. I think in one way the lawn would be a good example for him, but even the idea of like us building parks or us sanctioning off particular pieces of property and calling it a national park or a natural park or something like that, but giving us trails and guardrails and little signs and tour guides, all of those are sort of trying to mask the fact that we've gotten ourselves fairly removed. But finally, he says at some point, the world we live in really has no relationship to reality anymore. And he actually thought that we were getting fairly close to that. He thought we were getting toward this kind of idea that he called hyperreality, which is where we had simulated everything to the point where you could no longer really find nature as nature is, right? Thunderstorms don't scare us. Blizzards don't even scare us. It takes a huge weather catastrophe, like a close hurricane or gigantic fires, before nature really even threatens us a little bit. We don't worry about being able to get food if the crops don't come in this year because we'll have them shipped to us from somewhere else. This is why he thought that Disneyland was such a good example of hyperreality. He's going, look, there's the Matterhorn, not a real mountain, right? There's Space Mountain, not real space. They've got an entire area called Fantasyland where everything in there is made up, right? You've got a fake castle, a fake gold mine, fake train cars, fake mine carts, fake waterfalls, fake ponds, fake fish, right? Everything's fake, but we design it to look better than reality, and then we go there on vacation. So this is his concern, right? He's basically saying we keep layering more and more stuff on top of reality, building something that we like more. But this is where Baudrillard kind of says, okay, it's not enough to just say, look, it's kind of weird that we got away from natural world and have built this simulation around us. He says there's something deeply disturbing about this fact because simulation always suggests over and above its object, that is the thing it's simulating, that law and order themselves may be nothing more than a simulation. In other words, Baudrillard is concerned that if we're simulating merely the physical attributes of our world and it stopped there, whatever, right? But the simulation itself starts to imply that all of the rules and things that we view as concrete are actually just simulated. And if those are just simulated, then we have a problem. He says, essentially, and one of the professors, I think it's Dave Schweikert in Loyola's philosophy department. I was walking by him in the hall, and we weren't talking or anything. We passed in the hall, and I heard him say, "The problem with Baudrillard is you can't have ethics in hyperreality." And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Because that is actually what Baudrillard was concerned with. If we're inventing all of this stuff and we're removing ourselves farther and farther from the natural world, and we think about ethics as somehow being grounded in the natural world, then do we lose a sense of ethics altogether? Because if so, that's fairly shocking. I don't think Baudrillard was right. Uh, we seem to do very well with ethical systems put in place without needing to orient ourselves toward nature. I mean, in some ways, we saw this earlier with when we looked at Hobbes and Leviathan, right? Hobbes was big on trying to ground everything in nature. But Rawls basically rewrote Hobbes's form of social contract theory, but without any necessary relation to nature, right? Come to think of it, what Rawls did is actually very ingenious, right? The example we gave there was video games, right? Remember we talked about if we were all in a video game, but we didn't know who we were in the video game or what our attributes were going to be. We just kind of knew these were the general rules, and we wanted to come up with a theory of justice. We should be able to do that, right? Rawls was essentially arguing that we as a society gain our ethics from the fact that we're a society, not from the fact that there are two fundamental laws of the universe. It was that we would place those laws there because fundamentally we realize that that's what it takes to thrive as human beings. Not sure that Baudrillard ever really kind of approaches things that way. But Baudrillard gets even more terrifying in another aspect, and this is something that I think he was unfortunately right about. And this is where he says, okay, one of the problems with hyperreality is that we keep turning over control of this reality to the people who can tell it best. In other words, we kind of like our stories to be good. That's why we go to Disney World instead of going to Yellowstone, right? Or it's why we watch TV in the evenings instead of going out and sitting on the front porch and talking to the neighbors. Because there's something about us that likes the better narrative and appreciates the better and better storytelling. But the problem is then we delegate authority to the people who can tell stories. Consequently, in Baudrillard's mind, large media companies, governments, large multinational corporations, the people who can afford good storytelling become de facto rulers in hyperreality because they're the ones who can capture our attention the most easily. So Baudrillard says, all right, given that narrative, and let's say the evening news is a good example of this, right? Given that narrative, how do you break in as an outsider? And in the 70s and very early 80s, he's going, the thing I fear is that most of us will not care to break in. We will be content being fed information from those places and continue to enjoy being fed information, whether we believe it or not, because it's entertaining. But the people who want to break in will get increasingly violent because they know that the number one way to break in is to do something so horrible that the larger entertainment world can't look away. So the example he gave, the example he gave was terrorism. He said, I think that what's going to happen is you're going to see terrorism be leveraged as a way to break into the news cycle, right? And in fact, he seems to have been, unfortunately, very, very right. We can go back to 9/11, which was remarkable in the sense that every news station in the country and probably half of them in the world covered it live, right? So suddenly a dozen people captured the attention of the entire world, not by themselves, but because they did something so horrible that the media was a willing accomplice, right? And as were multinationals and governments, right? Everybody was a willing accomplice. They wanted to tell the story and figure out what to do about it. And that particular pattern we've seen repeat over and over again. There was a shooting in Las Vegas a few years ago that was like if Baudrillard wrote thrillers, this would have been it, right? Because Las Vegas is another quintessential hyper reality. You go there because what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? Prior to this event, the kinds of things we thought about with Las Vegas were, over the top hotels and canals inside of casinos and, 5-star restaurants and big giant shows and amazing multimedia displays, right? And then a shooter gets up in a hotel window and opens fire on a concert, and immediately they've co-opted themselves into the hyperreality, right? And now what else do we add on this Vegas list? Well, we add mass shooting, right, by some particular individual guy. He managed to sort of leverage himself into the hyperreality. Baudrillard, oddly enough, was convinced that the World Trade Center was like the pinnacle of hyperreality. He said the WTC actually stands for the completion of hyperreality. That was in 1983. In on September 11, 2001, that was the building that the planes crashed into, right? That the two planes crashed into first. In a way, it's unironic, right? It's chilling that Baudrillard was basically right, that terror has a way of interrupting hyperreality, and consequently, terror is a way for unempowered groups to attempt to seize power. Right? It's their one way to get a spotlight, and for obvious reasons, only the most unscrupulous of people end up doing this. But those unscrupulous people then, can make a huge name for themselves and can try and break in and wrest control away from a segment of the population that otherwise they would have no chance at taking on, right? So in a way, I think some of what Baudrillard thought was dangerous about simulation and hyperreality was overblown, right? But in another way, he was remarkably prescient about some of the real downsides to what we were creating. Uh, he predicted probably the most horrendous. Let me phrase it the other way. His most horrendous prediction that terrorism would become the preferred tool of unscrupulous people trying to break into hyperreality turned out to be pretty much the case, right? Now, for us, we're in a very interesting location. Our chosen field of study puts us sort of right in the middle of hyperreality, right? In a lot of cases, we're the ones who build it. Everything from us being the ones who advance self-driving cars and robotics, and neural networks and machine learning algorithms and things like that, uh, to us merely pushing the envelope of what people can do with computers, right? Video games included. What we do is going to define how other people experience life. In other words, in a very straightforward way, we're creating hyperreality, and how we create it is going to turn into the day-to-day experiences of other people. Look at the way social networking has changed the way people on a day-to-day basis interact with each other. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the new workplace and the contrast between today's workplace um, and what was there before is stark, right? And it's because of the way we empowered people to communicate remotely. But at the same time, we do have to stay sort of cognizant of the fact that Baudrillard is onto something when he says, look, we may be doing ourselves some harm if we're not really careful about what we do and how we do it. Baudrillard's view is pretty dark. But McGonigal in her book Reality is Broken kind of takes a different point of view, right? She says, all right, there's a lot of stuff, gaming included, gaming's her focus, right? Where, yes, there is a sense in which you could make it bad, right? Even if it were merely making a video game that was so much fun to play and so addictive that nobody could do anything else, that would be causing some amount of harm, right? Yet there are other ways in which we could try and harness these things and improve people's lives, right? There's some very trivial examples where, video games, several game manufacturers now do basically donation based things in the you know this time of year, really, right? Thanksgiving through the holidays, where you can donate some of your in-game platinum or coins or jewels or whatever to a cause that they chose or something like that. So there is a way there that it can be good. But McGonagall's interested in a deeper way in which we can do good, right? There may be games that we could construct that would actually make the world a better place because you were playing the game. She has this funny example of a game she invented called Killer Smile, and it went something like this: there were two teams that were formed up online at a university campus. She put out flyers everywhere and said, "Want to play a game this Saturday morning? Here's how you do it. Send an email here. We'll send you a team name and a location. You meet there on Saturday morning." So you end up with two teams who largely don't know who is in the other team, right? So you know who's on your team, but maybe not the other team. And the game went something like this. The objective was for Team A to for one team to kill everybody in the other team. How do you kill them? Well, you smile at them. The game's called Killer Smile. And when you smile at a member of the opposing team, uh, according to the game rules, the person who is smiled at must theatrically act out a death scene and then lie on the grass. Uh, so you can imagine a whole bunch of university students playing this, right? So they're out on campus and you're walking around and you see somebody and you're like, "Ooh, that might be somebody from the other team. I know they're not on my team, so I'm gonna smile at them." And you smile at them, and they smile back. So this was they're not playing the game, right? What was their experience of you playing the game? Somebody smiled at them, right? Smile at somebody else, they theatrically roll around on the grass and lay there and convulse. Everybody looks, laughs because it's really funny, and that person hops back up and is out of the game, right? McGonagall's point was it's a simple game. You know, it's nothing particularly special about this game. It's kind of silly, but in a way, the playing of the game introduced a small amount of good into the world. And she goes on from there in the rest of the book and talks about other ways that can introduce greater amounts of good and protection against other social dangers and things like that. She's got a great one about playing games in a cemetery as a way of removing fear, irrational fear of death, right? Games like that can do simple things to help the world in simple ways, and then she builds up into more and more complex ways of doing this. But it's interesting to see her basically trying to take the idea that we design little hyper realities and say, if we design them correctly, we can do a lot of good and we can accomplish some good stuff. So here we're kind of at the takeaway part here, right? So humans are remarkably adept at discerning moral choices inside of systems. Without anyone ever explaining to me the game, the social etiquette of the game Capture the Flag, I knew that that guy was being a jerk when he hit at the very top of that little thing and stayed the whole game there, right? It was easy for me to tell that he was not playing the game correctly. Largely, I think humans want to be moral, right? The ones who don't, we have particular names for them. We call them sociopaths or psychopaths, and they're a very scant minority, right? Largely, humans want to be moral. We want to play according to the rules and reap the rewards that that system has to offer, while allowing others to reap the rewards that system has to offer. So we, as creators of this stuff, have some obligations as we design hyper realities, right? As we come up with the next big thing, whatever follows on social media or whatever happens out of machine learning, right? Your duty is to clearly distinguish the rules of the game from the rules of the world, right? You don't want to intentionally confuse the two. You don't want to pull the Ender's Game scenario, right? Uh, and you want to do that because you want to meet people where they are. They want to play the game right. They want to follow the rules and have a good time and get the rewards and things like that. On top of that, as we build these kinds of hyper realities, we want to be fairly conscientious, right? We want to know that we are building games where, first of all, yes, in the game it's easy to discern these things, but also following McGonagall's lead, right? That we can do things that will introduce more goodness into the world. All right, I wanted to close with this little poem that McGonagall actually closes with at the end of her book by Eleazar Yudkowsky, where he says, if I'm going to be happy anywhere, or achieve greatness anywhere, or learn true secrets anywhere, or save the world anywhere, or feel strongly anywhere, or help people anywhere, I may as well do it in reality. McGonagall quotes this to point out, look, games are good. They help us feel good. They help us reap rewards. We as game makers uh, may find it very enjoyable and fulfilling to build worlds where people can find some happiness, right? But if you're gonna really do goodness somewhere, if you're gonna really help people improve their lives somewhere, make sure you do it in reality for them, right? All right, so that's where we've gotten tonight. We took a long, winding path through video games, talking about Descartes, talking about mind body dualism and evil deceivers. And we kind of wound our way through postmodernism and existentialism and different ways of looking at video games. But the point at the end of the day for us is we're at a very exciting stage in a very, very exciting career. And those of us who go into this field are in very real ways able to change the world. Sometimes people won't even understand how we changed the world until decades after it, right? When Facebook started, it looked like a gimmick. Now it changes the world, right? As we take on that responsibility, this is the place where the material in this course, right, the ethics can really take hold. This is where we learn, look, uh, we want to introduce good into the world. And more than that, we want to refrain from introducing evil into the world. How is it that we in our chosen profession can streamline that possibility for so many other people? All right, that's it for this week. Next week, we'll round it off with one final lecture, and we'll talk a little bit about the final.